Welcome to the weekly agricultural updates for July 12, 2026. We're jumping right into this explainer today to unpack some massive climatic and economic shifts that are completely reshaping India's agricultural sector right now. It's a seriously dynamic landscape out there. We've got a monsoon that has technically covered the country, but it's heavily moisture deficient, and that's clashing head-on with some really aggressive government policy interventions. The ripple effects? Well, they're spreading through literally everything, from local farm incomes all the way up to global commodity markets.
Negative 25%. That is a staggering number, right? That's the drop in the rice planting area across India as of late June, compared to this time last year. And the culprit? It's directly tied to that heavily moisture-deficient monsoon we just mentioned. We've actually just lived through the driest June in over a decade. We're talking a nearly 40% rainfall shortfall against early expectations. And you know, when your primary kharif crop takes a hit like that right out of the gate, it really sets a tense tone for the rest of the season.
To figure out how all this plays out, we're breaking this explainer down into 5 key areas: weather and weekly headlines, crop and regional intelligence, markets, policies and inputs, systems risks and strategic outlook, and finally, actionable stakeholder insights. Let's get to it.
Section 1, Weather and Weekly Headlines.
So looking at the weekly headlines for India, the southwest monsoon officially covered the entire country by July 9th, which was right on schedule. But as we know, coverage absolutely does not equal volume. Cumulative national rainfall is still hovering at 14% below normal, and the regional disparities here are super sharp. South India is dealing with a 15% deficit, but the East and Northeast, they are facing a really severe 38% deficit. And these aren't just abstract numbers, right? On the ground, this means massive moisture constraints on paddy nurseries and early transplanting in major states like Bihar, Odisha, and West Bengal.
What this tells us is that we aren't just dealing with a brief dry spell. The IMD, the Indian Meteorological Department, released their July outlook, and they pegged national rainfall below 94% of the long-period average. Basically, they're calling it a structurally weak monsoon month rather than just a transient anomaly. With the IMD forecasting subdued rainfall over central and south peninsular India for the days ahead, we're looking at continued serious stress for rain-fed belts in Maharashtra, Karnataka, and Telangana.
Moving on to Section 2, Crop and Regional Intelligence. Diving into our agroclimatic analysis, the big takeaway is that overall Kharif sowing is trailing by 23% compared to last year. Now, some heavy recent rains in the northwest have definitely helped narrow the total number of rainfall-deficient districts, but overall sowing is still significantly trailing the normal pace. And this is creating a pretty fascinating divergence based purely on local infrastructure.
Across these regional hotspots, we're essentially seeing two very different realities playing out side by side. In heavily irrigated belts like Punjab, Haryana, and Gujarat, a rainfall deficit mostly just bumps up electricity and pumping costs. Yields stay relatively stable because, well, the water's there. It just means a farmer's electricity bill might start looking like a phone number. But over in the rain-fed black soil tracts of Maharashtra, Karnataka, and Telangana, that exact same rainfall deficit translates directly to sowing delays, massive area contraction, and high yield risks for crucial crops like cotton, soybean, and pulses.
When we check out our crop intelligence regarding oilseeds, we hit a really pronounced stress point. The initial Kharif 2026 data shows soybean sowing is severely lagging, lower by over 13 lakh hectares. Groundnut is down by over 6 lakh hectares too. But get this, sunflower area is actually doing comparatively better. It's expanding. Why? Purely because of protective policy incentives and strong price signals. It's a great example of farmers adapting to market realities in real time.
Which brings us to Section 3, Markets, Policies, and Inputs.
Analyzing these market and policy signals impartially, it's clear the government has aggressively hiked minimum support prices across 14 different Kharif crops for the 2026-27 season. You can see a very deliberate strategy at play here. The steepest absolute hikes are in sunflower seed, which got bumped up by 622 rupees per quintal, along with cotton, Niger seed, and tur. So policy is intentionally tilting financial incentives toward oilseeds, pulses, and millets to try and stabilize those domestic supplies. Alongside those MSP hikes, we're seeing the state aggressively trying to absorb input economics. The nutrient-based fertilizer subsidy has been bumped up by roughly 11.6%, which locks the retail price of DAP, that's the most widely used phosphorus fertilizer, at exactly 1,350 rupees per bag. At the same time, the government is scrambling to secure domestic food buffers. They've extended a strict sugar export ban until at least September 30th and raised massive wheat procurement targets by 15% to 34.5 million tons. It's really a massive mobilization aimed at stabilizing both farm inputs and consumer inflation.
But, policy doesn't always perfectly dictate the market. Take this number, for example, 7,146 rupees. That's the current average nationwide mandi, or wholesale market price, for cotton per quintal. Why does that matter? Because it's noticeably below the new medium staple cotton MSP of 8,267 rupees. What that tells us is that while the MSP is supposed to provide a theoretical income floor, the actual market momentum in areas like cotton is still extremely weak right now.
All right, let's look ahead. Section 4, System Risks and Strategic Outlook.
When we map out the strategic outlook for the next 4 to 8 weeks, we're dealing with a very, very tight timeline. The agronomic calendar is entirely unforgiving. Over the next 1 to 2 weeks, stakeholders have this incredibly narrow window to catch up on delayed core Kharif plantings, especially paddy, cotton, and soybean. Fast forward to weeks 3 and 4, and literally all eyes will be on the Bay of Bengal, just hoping for fresh, low-pressure systems to bring rain to the central and eastern belts. Then, looking out 5 to 8 weeks, the focus has to shift towards assessing the strengthening impacts of El Niño on late-stage vegetative crop growth.
So, we're essentially looking at 2 major forecasting paths for the rest of the season. The base case scenario, which aligns with IMD expectations, assumes July rain remains below normal, allowing only a partial sowing catch-up. That would leave total acreage below last year's levels. But the adverse scenario? That is much more concerning. If El Niño strengthens and rainfall deficits persist, we lock in not just a reduced crop area, but major, widespread yield losses across multiple commodity categories.
Doing a deeper systems interpretation here, if that adverse weather holds, the hidden risks are going to compound rapidly. We aren't just talking about lower crop yields anymore. We're looking at widening our edible oil import dependence because of the undersown soybean and groundnut. We're looking at heightened pest stress, specifically from the pink bollworm, which absolutely thrives in rain-fed cotton, where delayed sowing leads to uneven crop stands. Toss in potential liquidity strains for sugar mills, thanks to that export ban, and a rural economy that's forced to rely heavily on credit rather than robust cash flows, and you've got a very precarious balancing act.
Finally, let's talk solutions. Section 5, Actionable Stakeholder Insights.
Breaking down the farmer-level implications, especially for smallholders in these rain-fed belts, the immediate steps are actually pretty clear. Step 1, pivot to short-duration, drought-tolerant pulses in millets if your primary sowing is delayed. Step 2, if you have access to irrigation and storage, you need to tactically leverage those higher MSP windows to lock in your revenue for wheat, paddy, and pulses. And Step 3, whatever you do not apply inputs blindly. Strictly time your fertilizer and seed applications using local panchayat and KVK agricultural science advisories so you can mitigate that moisture risk.
Zooming out for some broader actionable insights, agronomists really need to actively push moisture-efficient seeding techniques right now, like direct-seeded rice, and drastically intensify their pest surveillance for those staggered, uneven crops. And for the wider industry, agrotech startups have a massive immediate opportunity sitting right in front of them. It's time to move beyond basic advice. They need to deploy real-time moisture risk assessment tools and sowing optimization platforms directly to these smallholders who are operating on razor-thin margins.
As we wrap up this explainer, the data paints a picture of an agricultural sector fighting incredibly hard to adapt. This structural reliance on high fertilizer subsidies, aggressive public procurement, and rising MSPs, it's keeping the system afloat for now. But it leaves us with one vital, overarching question. Will India's policy safety nets actually hold against an increasingly unpredictable El Niño-driven climate? Or are deeper, medium-term agricultural reforms, the kind that genuinely diversify income streams and reduce this immense policy dependence, now absolutely mandatory? Definitely some to think about as we keep a close eye on the skies over the next few weeks.